Alright guys, so we're covering curves in terms of creating a fade. So later on we'll go over lots of styles you can create with fade, but right now I just want to get across why you are getting a fade and how to use the curves to create the fade. So you guys need to understand why this fade is occurring, because then you'll be able to make the necessary changes you need to make the style you want. So over here, you guys probably know that bringing up the black point creates a fade in the blacks. As you can see, it gets faded, and then same in the whites. Bring down the white point, you get a fade to those whites. So if we bring this point up, whites down, you can see those whites are fading out there. So some people would explain bringing up the black point up here, the sliders, you are brightening the blacks, but down here you are creating fades. They're not the same. Up here in the sliders is for brightening, down here is for creating a fade. That isn't exactly true. So down here in the curves, the reason it creates a fade is when we bring up the black point, the reason there is a fade is because there is less contrast. So what we're doing here is making the shadows, which is over here, almost the same brightness as the blacks over here on the left. And when you have an image with no contrast, you just get a solid gray image. So that is what's happening a little bit, and that's why it's creating a fade. And you don't get a fade over here in the blacks, because if you lift the blacks here, you're not lifting it up like this. You're not lifting it up with this curve here, but it's more like, say if we come over to these tools here and lift the darks, it acts a bit more like this. The adjustments up here react in a more gradual roll off. They're not gonna be these sudden changes that we achieve with this curve. Okay, so up here you don't get a fade because there is a smooth roll off of how it affects the brightness up here, like we went over in the exposure lesson. Okay, so another way the curves create a fade is that the curves overrule the sliders. And what I mean is, say we bring down the white point here, so that is bringing our whites down a lot. You can see the histogram, it has moved the whites from over on the right all the way back to about there. Now say in the sliders we bring up the whites, you can see they cannot move past that white point there. Can't go past it, so the curve overrides the effects up here in the sliders. And same goes in the black point. If we bring up the blacks up here, you can see in the histogram it moves the blacks over to the right, and if we try to bring down the blacks, it can't get past this area of the curve here. So if we have a curve that is down here in the whites, we have to work within this box here, and then that's obviously visible up here in the histogram. Okay, some things you have to watch out for when doing fades with the curves is, one, not losing detail in the highlights. So a lot of people say their image is this bright, and they come to the curves and they drop their white point, they want that fade, but they sort of start to lose all the details. Say those clouds start to disappear. So if we get like this image, this has a few clouds in it, and we drop that white point, but they keep their highlights up, and we start to lose that detail in the brighter areas. I'll go over how we can get around this. And then also another thing I see is when you do a fade, you say bring up the black point and you bring down the white point, and the image is just too flat. Like there's just too much fade in the blacks, you lose detail in the blacks, and the image just lacks depth. There's not enough contrast in the midtones, and I'll go over a bit more in depth about that soon. Okay, so let's have a look at this preset over here, curves, fade, balanced. So this curve adds a real fade to our image, and then it has a balanced S-curve in the color channels. Okay, so why would you have an S-curve in the red channel, green channel, and blue channel if you're trying to achieve a fade? Like an S-curve is the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, so why would you do an S-curve here? We want the flat look. Well, doing an S-curve in the channels here gives us the option of creating color adjustments, and we know how important the curves are for color adjustments. So this just gives us the option to pull more reds out of the shadows, but if we didn't have this S curve, we couldn't do that. And it also, for practical reasons, it's just a bit easier to do that, because say if we didn't have these curves here, let me just flatten them, now we have much less contrast, and we come back, it's just a bit harder to create a nice S curve. It starts to get very hard to do it. So like we're going to have heaps of points, and it's just a bit nicer to have those curves in the color channels. And then it also gives us the option for color adjustments, which is very necessary if you want to create a style. And as you can see, all these curves are completely perfectly balanced, so they're only affecting contrast at the moment. So they're all in the exact same spot, so no color adjustments are happening. Okay, so let's apply on this image over here, for example. This is a nice bright image. Let's go curves, fade, balanced. Okay, as you can see, the image is too bright. And that's because if we looked at the original, all this brightness over on the right, the image wants to be very bright. So if we apply the preset, and as you can see, for example, the white point has made those bright areas pushed back, or we have pushed them down up here, and the image wants to be that bright, but we have flattened it out with the curve, and we will have to come up here and let's bring it down and then drop the contrast as well. So if I bring that exposure back up again, you can see that we are losing detail on the whites because our brightness wants to be that bright. So to get detail back in the brighter areas, we have to bring the whites down below this point in the curves here. So if we bring it down, we now start to get a lot more detail back, because a lot of it was trying to sit above the curve here. And what happens then is it all gets flattened out and it starts to become the same brightness. And as we went over before, if it's the same brightness, there's going to be zero contrast. So that's why this looks very flat. It's getting very close to everything having the same contrast there. And then up in the histogram, you can see everything's getting squished to this white point here. Everything's being pushed to the right. It's all getting squished. We need to drag it out, and now we're a bit more spread between this area of the curve here that we have to work within, because generally without doing a faded style, properly exposed image in most cases would be having the whites almost touching here and the blacks almost touching over here, but we have changed it. We want a flat underexposed style. We have changed it to our new point for a well exposed image is going to be within this box. So for the black point, it's here, which up in the histogram will be about here, and then for the whites it will be about up here. And that's how you get an underexposed flat style. So if you were there, if you were in the environment and you took the picture, it's pretty obvious that this is a bright environment, but it has a real fade to it. What I always think about when I see this sort of style is you have your image and then you've placed a see-through bit of paper over top, and it just really flattens out the image. Okay, so let's go back to this image and let's just make it look a bit nicer by enabling profile correction. Come back up, maybe a few more highlights or whites. I quite like that before and after. So if you keep your eye on the histogram, stretched out all the way there and almost all the way to the blacks as well. Go back. Now we've really contained it within this box here. So let's apply this preset to a few other ones. So over here, fade, balanced. Again, the image, it's quite bright and washed out. And the reason it's bright and washed out is because a lot of the brightness wants to sit above this line that we've created here. So we're going to bring it below it and we start to get the detail back. A bit brighter, shadows, highlights, and then it sort of becomes personal preference on your style. But we want an evenly exposed image, but within our new points here. So again, we place it here. We need to bring down the exposure, contrast. Let's bring the highlights up, all the whites, create a bit of a pop, shadows. So it looks really good, and you could just apply this to your images and it would very quickly create a very unique look to your images. So before and after, and then I'm just very quickly doing this, but hopefully you can start to see that real flatness. A darker shot, fade, you can see how those bright areas aren't so bright anymore, and those dark areas are really brought up. And then this one, bring down the exposure a bit, it's quite cold, something like that. Before and after, bringing down those highlights, bringing up those blacks a bit. We'll just put it on this one as well, and then bring down the exposure. And as you can see, it almost gives off the shine to the image, this kind of curve. It's hard to describe, but there's some sort of shine that gives off. Okay, so back over to this image. So some people might think they could achieve something like this by just using the sliders up here. So maybe if we just turn off these, let's just try to achieve the same thing but with just the sliders here. So this person might just really drop the contrast, exposure a bit, whites down, highlights down, blacks come up. So really taking out all of the contrast. It looks a little too flat. Maybe they'll try to drop the blacks to try to have a bit more in. Yeah, and it looks okay. It looks good. But the problem is, as you can see, you still get some whites in close to the right there. We could try bring it down more. You're starting to get pretty flat, but where it's different is how harshly the drop off is on these adjustments. So I'll try to explain this curve here. Let's just quickly get the contrast back, taking out lots of that contrast. Okay, back where we were pretty much. So the main takeaway is up here, these adjustments up here very gradually affect the highlights, for example. They affect the image a lot more like this tool here. So if we click this little tool, you get this up, and whenever we say move the highlights or the lights, you can see how it creates a nice curve to your adjustment here, and you can see how it just affects your adjustments like a curve, like a slow gradual effect. And slow gradual effects won't give you a fade. So coming back to this tool here where we can plot the points, so this curve here is much harsher, and you could imagine everything that wants to be above this line in the image gets cut off and is kept below it. So like we talked about in the exposure one, these have a more gradual effect. By dropping the whites, you're not gonna get an effect like this. You can't get that. So that's where the curves come in. So up here, you're just gonna get smooth changes to your shadows or your blacks or your whites or your highlights. Up here, you have the ability to make a pretty sharp transition from blacks to shadows. So here, our blacks and shadows are pretty much the same brightness, and that's what creates a harsher fade. But we have our whites below this point in the curve, and that allows us to still see our detail. Okay guys, so the main takeaways are that the curve overrules your effects up here in the sliders. If you want your whites really bright, they will be capped off. If you make an adjustment in the curves, such as bringing down the whites here, it overrules your adjustments up here, and we are now working within this box here. And also that you can't get a sharp change in contrast with the sliders up here because they have like a smooth roll off like we went over in the exposure lesson, and up here you can get a much sharper transition of highlights to whites or blacks to shadows, and that decreases the contrast between the shadows and blacks, which is what creates the fade. Say, exaggerated example, heaps of fade now, and we have very little contrast. So if we only did that in the blacks and shadows, you can see blacks and shadows have that fade, and we are just getting kind of close to that with a curve like this. Okay guys, so that's just one example of using the curves, a pretty exaggerated example. This is a pretty extreme fade, and there's plenty of other ways to use the curves to do a fade, but I'll cover heaps of different styles in another one. This is just so you know why you are creating a fade when you create a curve like this. So if you have any questions, leave them in the Facebook group, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.